start today with a list, a catalog of revolutions, actually.
Okay.
The libertarian economist Tyler Cowen, he recently did this retrospective on his life. He's someone who tracks how the world shifts on its axis
Okay.
around.
He pays attention to those massive macro trends.
Exactly. And he listed the major disruptions he's personally witnessed, starting all the way back from the moon landing when he was a kid up to the generative AI boom that we're living through right now.
Which really is a highlight reel of the late 20th and early 21st centuries. I mean, you have the collapse of the Soviet Union, the invention of the internet, the rise of the smartphone, all the standard geopolitical and technological hits.
Yeah, but sandwiched right there in the middle, like right between the fall of the Berlin Wall and the birth of the World Wide Web, he lists a revolution that usually doesn't make the history books in the same way. He calls it the Great Feminization.
And just to clarify for everyone listening before we really dive into this, Cowan and the author we are focusing on today, Helen Andrews, they aren't talking about the suffragettes.
Right.
They aren't talking about 1970s feminism or, burning bras. They're pointing to a very specific, quiet, but total demographic overhaul of institutional power.
And that is the mission for today's deep dive. We are unpacking a provocative and frankly a pretty controversial essay by Helen Andrews. Her thesis is that while everyone was distracted by the internet or the culture wars, a demographic revolution occurred in the background, one that has fundamentally rewired the operating system of civilization.
It's a thesis that challenges a lot of modern assumptions. Because Andrews argues that the shift of women into the highest levels of governance and law and corporate control, it isn't just a change in personnel. She argues it's a change in values. And she believes this shift explains everything from what we call wokeness to the decline of free speech.
Now, before we get into the consequences, and they are significant, we need to establish the scale here. Because when I hear the word feminization, I naturally think of a slow process.
Right.
A gradual thing. Yeah, a gradual opening of doors over 50 or 60 years. But Andrews argues we're actually looking at something much newer and much faster than that.
Yeah, she calls it the missing revolution for a reason. Her argument is that we tend to think of female representation as this long, gradual upward slope. But if you look at the hard data, especially in elite institutions, the vertical spike happened mostly in the last 10 to 15 years.
Wow.
It wasn't a slope at all, it was a cliff.
And we are serving as impartial guides here today, folks, to just outline her arguments. And the first way she illustrates this speed is by using the judiciary as her primary case study.
It's probably the starkest example of the trend you could find. So go back to 1981, Sandra Day O'Connor is appointed to the Supreme Court.
The first woman.
Right, the first. And at that time, only 5% of federal judges in America were women. It was barely tokenism. But fast forward to today. 4 women sit on the Supreme Court. That's just one away from a majority.
That's a huge jump.
And nationally, 30% of judges are women. In California, it's 40%. And significantly, 63% of President Biden's appointees were women.
So in historical terms, we basically went from the first woman ever to statistically dominant in roughly one working lifetime.
Exactly.
That is a blistering pace for institutional change.
And that's just the judges.
Uh-huh.
Look at the pipeline. Law schools are now majority female. Medical schools.
Also majority female.
Right. The white-collar workforce with college degrees is majority female. Andrews points out that 46% of all managers in the United States are women. We aren't talking about women entering the workforce anymore.
We are talking about women running it.
Running it, yeah.
Which brings us to where her argument shifts from demographics to dynamics. She introduces a concept that I found really fascinating to wrap my head around: the tipping point. She argues that gender integration doesn't usually result in a stable 50-50 split.
This is a really crucial insight for understanding her entire worldview. Because we tend to assume the goal of integration is parity right, a nice even balance.
Half and half.
Yeah, but Andrews observes that once a field hits a critical mass of women, the culture of that field changes to accommodate female preferences. And once that culture changes, men tend to exit. She literally calls it an evacuation.
And psychology is the example she highlights to prove this mechanism right.
It's a dramatic shift. 25 years ago, psychology was about 70% male. It was a field very much focused on clinical detachment, objective analysis, and judging behaviors against a norm.
Okay.
Today, the youngest cohort entering the field is 80% female.
80%. That's massive. And her theory isn't that men just suddenly stopped caring about how the human mind works. It's that the field itself stopped being about clinical analysis and started being about empathy.
Precisely. The profession reoriented around what she calls feminine values, things like non-judgmentalism and validation and care. So if you are a man interested in rigorous, somewhat detached analysis, what we might call the hard side of psychology, the field no longer feels like it was built for you.
The incentives have shifted.
All right, the incentives shift, so you just go elsewhere.
She sees a similar evacuation in literature and publishing, too, which I think really resonates with anyone who walks into a bookstore these
Oh,
days.
totally. The publishing industry is now nearly 80% female. And Andrews brings up those recurring New York Times op-eds that always ask with great concern, why don't men read novels anymore?
Right, I've seen those.
Her answer is blunt. She says men do like stories. They have always liked stories. They just don't like the specific type of introspective, empathy-driven fiction that a female-dominated industry chooses to publish.
So the industry essentially optimizes for its own demographic, which
Yeah.
effectively alienates the other half of the population.
Yeah.
But let's pivot to the heavy lifting of her thesis here. The so what question. Why does it matter if psychologists and book editors are women? Does that actually change the world?
This is where she connects demographic feminization to what is broadly called wokeness.
Hmm.
And this is probably the most controversial part of her entire argument.
It was certainly the most striking part of the essay for me. She argues that wokeness isn't some ideological virus that just appeared out of nowhere. She calls it an epiphenomenon.
Which is really just a fancy way of saying it's a symptom, not the disease.
Right.
She argues that if you list the core traits of wokeness, things like safetyism policing language, to prevent harm, prioritizing emotional inclusion over abstract rights, those map perfectly onto well-documented psychological traits that are simply more common in women.
And she cites actual survey data on free speech versus inclusion to back this up, so it's not just anecdotal.
Yeah, the polling is remarkably consistent on this. When you ask people to choose between protecting free speech and preserving a welcoming, inclusive society, men break roughly 2/3 in favor of free speech.
And win.
Women break roughly 2/3 in favor of inclusion.
So her logic is pretty simple then. If you fill the decision-making rooms of universities and HR departments and tech companies with women, the institution will naturally pivot away from free speech and towards safety.
Exactly. Not because of some grand conspiracy, but because that's just the natural preference of the people sitting in the room.
It really boils down to the ethics of justice versus the ethics of care.
Yes, and this is a distinction used by moral psychologists like Carol Gilligan. The ethics of justice is traditionally masculine. It values abstract rules, rights, and objective truth, regardless of who gets their feelings hurt in the process.
It's that old Voltaire spirit, right? I may disagree with what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it.
That is a purely masculine, justice-based framework. The ethics of care, on the other hand, is highly contextual. It asks who is being hurt here? How does this affect our relationships? Is this safe? And Andrews argues that as women took over institutions, the ethics of justice was systematically dismantled and replaced by the ethics of care.
She points to the James Damore firing at Google as a perfect real-world example of this clash. For listeners who don't remember, he was the engineer who wrote that internal memo about gender differences.
Right. Damore wrote a memo suggesting biological differences might partially explain the gender gap in tech. Now, Andrews notes that Google didn't fire him because he was factually wrong. They didn't really hold a debate about his data or his citations.
They fired him because his memo made female employees feel unsafe.
Exactly. The care ethic, meaning protecting feelings and maintaining social cohesion, completely overrode the truth ethic or the debate ethic.
And then we have the Kavanaugh Supreme Court confirmation hearings. She uses that, and it felt like a national referendum on this exact divide.
The Kavanaugh hearings were essentially a televised collision of these two worldviews. The masculine argument was entirely procedural. Where is the evidence? You cannot destroy a man's life without proof. The presumption of innocence is paramount.
And the opposing argument wasn't just, we have evidence, it was, look at her pain.
Yes, believe women. The core argument was that the severity of the accusation and the palpable emotion of the accuser should outweigh procedural rigor. And Andrews sees this not just as a partisan political fight, but as a glaring sign that the legal system itself is shifting from objective adjudication to empathetic management.
Which leads us to a really fascinating term she coined, the celebration parallax.
Oh, I love this concept.
Yeah.
It explains so much of our current discourse. The celebration parallax is the unwritten rule that says you are allowed to notice that women are changing institutions, but only if you frame it as an upgrade.
Right, so if you say female judges bring much-needed empathy to the bench, you get applause. But if you say female judges are undermining the rule of law by prioritizing empathy over the statute, you are a pariah.
Even though both statements are describing the exact same phenomenon, women are bringing empathy to the law. Andrews is consciously stepping into that pariah role here. She is making the case that the ethics of care is actually corrosive to civilization-level institutions.
So what is the specific danger she sees? Why can't we just have a more caring civilization? Because, honestly, that sounds pretty nice on paper.
Her concern is unpredictability. The rule of law requires coldness. It requires that the law applies to everyone equally, regardless of their personal story or their trauma.
Right, it has to be blind.
Exactly.
Yeah.
If the legal system prioritizes care, meaning if it starts ruling based on who is the victim and who needs help the most, then the law becomes entirely subjective. It's no longer a system of rules. It's a system of emotional management.
And you can't build on that.
No, because a civilization cannot function if contracts and laws depend on how the judge feels about you on any given Tuesday.
She applies this to the corporate world as well, specifically the massive rise of HR departments.
Yeah, she calls it HR compliance culture. She argues that a risk-averse, safety-obsessed corporate culture kills innovation. It creates an environment where avoiding conflict is seen as more important than actually solving problems.
Because innovation requires breaking things sometime.
Exactly. And it discourages the disagreeable risk-takers who historically are usually men who actually drive breakthroughs.
Yeah.
Her point is, if you can't be disagreeable, you can't disrupt anything.
There's also a pointed critique she makes regarding immigration. She argues that our inability to enforce borders is a direct result of this feminization.
It's the care ethic again.
Yeah.
We have laws on the books. That's the masculine structure. But enforcing those laws requires sending people home, which is mean.
Yeah.
It causes visible suffering.
Right.
So we have this feminized elite that refuses to enforce the masculine laws because they simply cannot stomach the emotional cost. The law exists on paper, but the care ethic nullifies it in practice.
Now, the counter-argument here feels fairly obvious. Can't we have women in power who don't do this? Like, can't we have a female judge who is a strict constitutionalist? I mean, Andrews acknowledges they exist. She's kind of one of them in a way.
She definitely does.
Yeah.
But she differentiates between individuals and populations. She asks, can we have demographic feminization without substantive feminization? And her answer is a flat no.
Why not?
Because you cannot change the demographic composition of the ruling class so drastically and expect the values of that ruling class to remain completely unchanged. Groups just behave differently than individual outliers.
So if she believes this demographic shift is dismantling the structural integrity of civilization, what is the solution? Is she suggesting some sort of Handmaid's Tale scenario where women are banned from working?
No, and she is very explicit about that. She says, I don't propose banning women. She recognizes that the genie's out of the bottle. Her solution is to, in her words, take the thumb off the scale.
And what exactly is the thumb in this analogy?
She identifies two artificial pressures that she believes are forcing this feminization well beyond what might happen naturally. The first is civil rights laws, specifically the concept of disparate impact.
We should probably unpack that legal concept for you listening so it makes sense.
Yeah, disparate impact is a legal theory that basically says if a company has a neutral policy, say a physical fitness test or a specific cognitive test that unintentionally results in fewer women being hired, that policy is considered discriminatory.
Even if there was no intent to discriminate.
Right? Intent doesn't matter. Andrews argues this forces companies to socially engineer their workforces to hit gender targets purely to avoid massive lawsuits.
This is where her controversial line about getting rid of the HR ladies comes from, right?
Yeah, it was a bit of a punchline, but a serious one. She argues HR departments largely exist today to police liability and ensure the company doesn't get sued for discrimination. And this creates a soggy, conflict-averse culture designed to protect the company rather than to maximize performance.
So her proposal is to just change that law.
Reform, but yeah, stop suing companies for statistical disparities. Let them hire strictly based on merit and the pipeline. And if the result is that a certain field is 80% male, then let it be 80% male.
And what's the second thumb on the scale?
the two-income trap. This is actually an economic argument popularized by Elizabeth Warren originally.
Oh, really?
Yeah, Andrews argues that a lot of women are in the corporate grind, not because they deeply love being mid-level compliance officers, but because the modern economy has been structured to essentially require two incomes just to maintain a basic middle-class life.
So she wants a policy shift that makes single-income families viable again.
Correct. She believes that if families had a genuine economic choice, many women would opt out of the careerist path. The demographic balance would settle organically. It would likely result in fewer women in high-power institutional roles, but perhaps a happier society overall for both men and women.
You know, we really have to talk about the paradox of Helen Andrews herself here. She is a woman. She is a highly educated, public intellectual writing controversial essays. She is leaning into the discourse.
She totally owns that paradox. She admits she likes her career. She admits that the masculine standards-based society she's advocating for would be less welcoming to her personally. It would be a colder, harder place where her feelings matter less.
She actually has this great line about being a disagreeable woman.
Right, she says, I'm a woman with disagreeable opinions, so a conformist, safety-obsessed society is bad for me too. But her final argument elevates it beyond just her own self-interest. She frames it as a duty to the future. She asks us to consider what is genuinely necessary for the survival of civilization, not just what makes us feel good individually in the moment. She argues that civilization requires a certain level of risk aggression and objective rule enforcement to survive in the long run.
The ethics of justice again.
Yes. And if we allow the ethics of care to completely erode those foundations in the name of safety and inclusion, we might find that the walls protecting us and protecting our children aren't nearly as strong as we thought. She implies that civilization is fragile and niceness isn't enough to keep the lights on or the borders secure.
It really challenges the modern assumption that we can just have it all.
Wow.
That we can have maximum safety and maximum freedom at the same time. Maximum empathy and maximum competence.
Andrew says we have to choose.
Hmm.
And right now we're actively choosing comfort over structure. She leaves the reader with a very uncomfortable question. Can a society dominated by the ethics of care actually survive in a hostile world?
And, you know, building on that makes you wonder about the global stage. If our internal domestic institutions are entirely governed by an ethics of care, but the international arena dealing with hostile nations' global competition still operates strictly on a ruthless ethics of power and justice, what happens when those two realities inevitably collide?
That is the ultimate stress test for her theory, isn't it?
It really is. Whether you agree with her premise or find it completely regressive, it certainly forces you to look at the modern institutional landscape through a radically different lens. It makes you notice who is in the room and what values are actually governing the decisions being made.
And that's the goal.
Yeah.
To see the water we're all swimming in.
Well, that's it for this deep dive into Helen Andrews and the Great Feminization. It's a heavy one, but definitely worth thinking about. Thanks for exploring it with us. See you next time.